Okay, well, today I'm here with Lamont from Days of French and Swedish. Thank you very much for being here with me, Lamont. Give me some of your time. I know that we have some crossover between followers, but I'm assuming that there will be some people watching this who don't know who you are. So, would you mind doing the whole introduction thing? Tell us a bit of who you are and what you do.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, by the way. Yeah, my name's Lamont. I'm from Australia. I haven't been outside of Australia in a very long time. About 5 years ago, I got really, really interested in learning Swedish. Um, and then I kind of started just getting interested in languages in general. I learned Swedish and French for a couple of years. I decided I wasn't good enough at either of them, so I have been focusing on Swedish for the last 18 months. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. I really only speak Swedish to a decent level.
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah, we're definitely going to get into some of that in a minute, but yeah, some of what I want to ask you has a bit more to do with kind of, or at least to start with, is a bit more to do with kind of, yeah, a bit more about you as a person and how those kind of things relate to your experience with language learning and things. And I know that you've done quite a lot of interviews and different stuff. So if anyone's watching this and feels like, oh, this bit of information I would have liked to have known, there's probably somewhere else you could go and find out beyond this introduction. So we're going to get into lots of stuff. But first of all, I'm quite interested to know, who was Lamont before languages, in the sort of sense, like, do you think that you have changed very much, either as a learner or just as a person in general? Obviously, you're quite intense with language learning and stuff these days. Have you always been quite involved in everything you do? And how do you think of, yourself before languages, if at all different?
Mm. Well, there's kind of two answers that seem quite different. One is that I was exactly the same person before languages. I always did everything very intensely and for relatively short periods of time, like 3 years, 4 years, maybe 5 years at a stretch. And then I would not deliberately, but just somehow just drop that thing completely in search of the new thing. And yeah, so it wasn't that I didn't like the old thing anymore. It was always just something else would just catch my eye,
Hmm.
and I would do that and it'd just go all in on that. And I can never predict what they are, and other people certainly can't predict what they're going to be.
Hmm.
Because you described it before when we were talking as like you have like your main goal, a main quest and side quests or
Right.
something. Um, Thankfully, I've never been into video games because that would be an awful combination with my obsessive personality, and like
Yeah.
I would just be all in on video games. So thankfully, I've kind of never explored that world, and I don't intend to. But um, yeah, I wouldn't deliberately leave anything alone. I would just pursue the next thing with full intensity,
Hmm.
um, which is actually, I think, quite frustrating because you get really good at things quickly because you do
Hmm.
it so much, but you sort of never get good enough to for it to be like really useful.
Right.
Uh,
Hmm.
my one before languages was photography.
Okay.
Now I do actually work on the day to day as a photographer.
Hmm.
Um, so that kind of, yeah, I guess that one did work out. But a lot of other things, but I'm not interested in photography anymore. I literally
Okay.
I go to work and I look at the camera the same way as a mechanic looks at a spanner. It's just a thing to get the job done.
Right. Okay.
And I don't. I try to take photos for my own pleasure because it's like, and of my kids and stuff. I try to take nice photos, but I really have to kind of push myself to do that. But
Right.
so in one way, exactly the same person.
Hmm.
In another way, I don't like myself very much from before I started getting into languages. As in, I don't like who I was then. Not, I don't know if it was languages that changed it or just coincidence of timing,
Hmm.
but I was never really deliberately engaged with anything. That is, I, I don't know how you would put it. I was never interested in the idea that I had to actually get off my ass and do something in order to actually pursue some kind of success in life, if that makes. I
I
don't
think
like kind
so.
of using these terms, but
Yeah.
like, you know, I just kind of, I lived a very passive, my 20s were very passive,
A
I
sort
would
of
say.
theoretical life, more planning
I just,
and thinking rather than
yeah.
doing.
And I just expected that one day my life would all just work out and the things I wanted would come to me. And
Hmm.
right. And it was around a little bit after I started learning Swedish, and it wasn't through learning Swedish, but it was just, I sort of discovered this idea that it's like, you are the only person who can do anything about your life. If your life isn't the way you want it to be, then you're the only one who can change that.
Hmm.
And you need to stop making excuses for yourself and stuff. And,
Hmm.
it's all these messages we've heard before from self-development and
Yeah.
things that people find like very cheesy. But I just heard it one day in the right way. I just heard
Yeah.
it put to me in words that I understood.
Right.
And I started listening to that. And so that happened, I would say, about a year after I started learning Swedish. So that's, in a way, that's what's propelled me to really push my Swedish to a level that I can actually use for something that I wouldn't have been able to before.
Hmm.
Is this idea that it's like, yeah, I could go and do something else, something that caught my eye. I could get into, brewing my own beer or learn a different language or
Yeah.
just do all this stuff on a very kind of mediocre level.
Hmm.
But if I want to actually, for example, my YouTube channel, if I want to help people to learn a language, I need to show that I've done this to an unusual level, like
Right.
not just to like a little, I speak a little bit of Swedish and a little bit of French. I need to show that I've done this to a level that's other people would want to achieve.
Hmm.
So I've kind of gone after that, and I sort of don't like talking about this and all because it makes you seem like a real jerk if you're just kind of like, oh, like I've pursued this for a certain reason, but
Right.
I would say I didn't have much reason before, and now
Right.
I do.
Yeah, yeah. I can relate with a lot of that actually because yeah, I've done a lot of different things through the years. I call it shiny object syndrome, right? Like just to the next shiny thing.
Yeah.
But for me, I'd been doing a lot of stuff that was kind of like add-ons to what I'd done previously. So I started doing personal training, then I moved to calisthenics, then I moved from calisthenics to acrobatics. They're different, they're new, but they're also same but different sort of thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, with languages, it was like something a lot more from zero, let's say, relative to other stuff that I'd been learning. And yeah, taking that to a higher level kind of made me realize that yeah, I haven't been doing that with other stuff, and yeah, you get that kind of that level of motivation. I'm interested in what you said about how you want to be able to help other people through your channel, and to do that you need to achieve results that are that other people would want to achieve, that are higher than the average person achieves. Which is interesting because there is obviously that a lot of that makes sense, but then I'm also thinking about other instances of people teaching things or coaching things, instructing things, and there always comes this argument where if you can't do something, then you can't teach it. Certainly in the world of physical skills, that isn't true, right? I don't know, the best football coaches aren't the best football players, the best gymnastic coaches often haven't won gold medals. Do you think that is decidedly different in relation to like a YouTube channel? I mean, that's a lot to process for a question, but
Yeah. I think it is pretty different because I think the reason behind why the reason that that a gymnastics coach can still teach a gymnast to a gold medal, even though they themselves didn't win a gold medal. There's a fair bit of circumstance around that, and so you could have someone who was actually like did actually know all these amazing training techniques and really understands the person that they're coaching and understands how to motivate them to train for that extra hour every day or whatever. You can have someone who does all that, but who can't do it themselves because of physical injury or because at the time that they were competing, their team just didn't have the resources or whatever. Like, there could be lots of reasons that didn't happen, but And the same with football. It's like, a coach is generally going to be older and they're coaching 11 players, not just themselves. And so, like, I think they have to know the principles.
Right.
And for me, I just don't know what excuse there would really be that, like, I haven't done this, but you should. I just don't really I kind of don't know what that would be. So, actually, I had a video a few months ago about Anki that was like deliberately kind of dramatized, but it was an extension of my own feeling about Anki and how I feel like it's a good thing to use, but I had trouble getting myself to use it.
Right.
And I have actually essentially coached myself into using it
Right.
through like the thoughts around that video and everything. And now I do, and I feel like my Swedish is like rapidly relative to my current level, which is already quite high. I actually make noticeable improvements every week through the use of Anki, and so now I kind of have helped myself to understand, okay, how do I get myself to use this despite not liking it, and blah blah blah. And so now I can help other people to do that, if that's something they want to do. But I can also understand why it might not be. And so I think that's a little bit different in that all of that would be pure theory if I didn't do that myself. And so now I'm kind of thinking about going back to a language that I understand a lot less of, because Swedish has become so obvious for me to understand. Like when I watch stuff in it or read stuff in it or whatever, it's like, am I really even learning a language anymore?
Right.
I'm really just, it's like almost like reading in English. So now I feel like to help people, I need to go back to a level where I understand less and whatever. But yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, because it's like, let's say the gymnastics example. Okay, fine, your gymnastic coach didn't win Olympic gold medal. They weren't competing for a place on the Olympic team, but they competed in NCAA or in high school, or like they know gymnastics. Like they've done gymnastics. They have those experiences, and so like you say, you can take those principles and apply them to other things. But yeah, no, I think it totally makes sense that having that experience yourself, it allows you to kind of empathize with other people and to understand what they go through, because obviously the better you get at something, the less consciously aware you are of why you are good at that thing, and so it becomes harder and harder to be able to explain it to people that are earlier in that stage.
And the other thing is that even if it was a case of like, no, you could actually be an amazing language learning coach, for want of a better term, even without having learnt a language to a high level yourself. Even if that were the case, which I kind of have disagreements with that I just expressed, there would still be the practical issue of like, you're presenting yourself on YouTube as someone who knows how to do this, so where's your evidence for this kind of thing? Like,
yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, okay. And obviously you've got the channel, like you've been running for a couple of years now. I guess I don't know how long your channel's been up for, but because we spoke earlier in a different conversation for your Patreon, you mentioned about how initially you might have envisioned your channel more like showing progress of you speaking Swedish, and things like that. But now you've got a lot of, you're I don't know if you would call it teaching or whatever, sharing information, sharing your experiences and things. How deep into your journey of engaging with language learning did you start to think about the possibility of sharing your experiences, of helping other people with it? Was that like the intention always, or was it something that as you got further into it, you maybe thought that I'm doing okay with this, maybe I can help other people to do okay with it as well? Or how did that process look for you in terms of wanting to share what you're doing?
I think it came from, I actually started a YouTube channel totally separate to language learning. Well, almost totally separate. I wanted to speak about, I wanted to do reviews of series and films that were not in English. So foreign, what we English speakers would call foreign series and films. because like almost no one talks about them, and it was almost exclusively what I watched. So I was like, I just wanted to basically become like the Chris Stuckman, if anyone knows who that is like a movie reviewer, movie critic, of foreign series. And at the beginning, when you first start doing YouTube regularly, you often don't really know what you're doing videos about. So I did actually kind of just started by accident, that I started talking about language learning directly, because one day I did a video about how I'd reached 800 days of a Duolingo streak. And that video did comparatively well, which is to say that it got like 50 views instead of 10 views. And I like, it sounds a bit bad, but I was like, oh, well, let's do more of that then. Because as a YouTuber, you do actually have to kind of just keep going back to the well of what's worked before. And so, but it sort of became its own thing. That is, I liked doing the videos about language learning, and these days I don't do many of the series reviews. And I just like talking about the language learning process more. But the other thing is that it has helped me to not succumb to shiny object syndrome too much, in that it's like I'm now sort of somewhat dependent on this channel. So I have to keep doing this, which is actually a good thing. It sounds like a bad thing, but it's like, well, no, it keeps me accountable to keep doing this and to keep getting better at the language or languages I speak, and not just go out and just do a bit of this and a bit of that, and maybe I'll just get into motorcycling or something. It's like, well, how am I going to bring that back to what I am known for talking about? So it's just a bit of a chicken or the egg thing. It's like, I talked about it, became successful, I talked about it more, and that helped me to talk about it more. But no, to answer your question, it was never the intention to talk about it. I didn't really have an active YouTube channel, so.
Fair enough. Okay, yeah. I guess that's how it happens for a lot of people. You know, with my little channel, I kind of did specifically make it so I could, share what I was doing or whatever, not because I necessarily thought I was going to be this shining light in the language learning community and bring all these new, shiny, amazing ideas, but I think, just personally at least, that there's a lot of value in all of us sharing our experiences, learning from each other's mistakes and different things like that. So, I guess for some people like me, there is that clear intention, but for a lot of people, it's just a thing that happens.
Yeah. No, but for the record, I think it's actually a matter of time. I don't know how long, but I think it's a matter of time before your channel gets a lot more attention than you're used to. It happened to me. You just have a video that for some reason more people click on than any other video, and YouTube just goes nuts with it. And one day you'll just wake up and go, where did all these views come from? And you've got the body of work, like you've already got enough videos that it can keep people watching and everything. Right. So this is just a side note. I think your channel is due to take off at some point.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. But yeah, I mean, it's like that thing that you say, it's for whatever reason, you can't make it happen. You can't, well, I suppose some people will claim you can hack the algorithm, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think, I mean, for me, I think it would stress me out trying to chase virality or whatever. But it's probably not the best way to go about creating in general, is it? Just to try and get loads of people to love what you do. I mean, it's difficult because there's always a balance, right? You have the purists that say you make your content for you, but if it's if you don't care what anyone else thinks about it, why did you put it on YouTube? It's a bit of a double-edged.
And the other thing is that, like, I was saying to someone the other day that because of just the work that the quality to which I like to make my videos, and that's always going up. Like last year, I thought my videos were good quality, but this year I'm like, well, now they're better, and I can't stand to watch last year's ones. Because of that, they take me longer than they did even at the beginning. Even when I sucked at making videos, they now take me just as long, if not longer. So there is the reality of like, do I really want to lay my heart and soul into this for 2 weeks just to have 500 people watch it, or if I call it this other thing, then 50,000 people will watch it. So there is, yeah.
We might get into
There
some of
is,
those elements in a later question as well. We'll see how we get on. But
okay.
yeah, I mean, in relation to your channel, obviously, a lot of people make videos about their experiences, how they've been getting on with language learning and things. But to me, at least, it seems like what attracts a good amount of people to your channel is there seems to be quite a lot of depth. Let's say you care about what you're talking about. It looks like you've thought a lot about the ideas that you're presenting and what they would mean for the listeners and all this kind of stuff. And I was interested, do you consider yourself as a person that just generally is quite reflective and you're just, I don't know, you walk knocking about and suddenly something comes to you and you follow that? Or do you have like specific times where you're going to sit down and think about this specific idea, you're going to research what other people thought, or structure? I'm curious as to where those ideas and things come from and how that process might look.
It's the first one of those two that I'm just thinking about something, and I'll think about it for a very long time without any particular breakthrough about it. And then one day I'll just kind of go, it's a bit like this, like it's a bit like this thing. And that helps me open up a whole new, but like, I don't consider myself as being, well, I didn't consider myself as being a reflective or like profound person or anything until I started, and it's not just been through YouTube, but until I started sharing ideas that I had, and people were like, that's like pretty good. And I was like, wow, I think like that all the time. Like that's just my mind.
Right.
But like that sounds really like vain, like, oh, it's just my mind. But like,
I know what you mean. Yeah.
I'm like, that's just what's going on in my head 24/7, and I just put this one on paper.
Right.
So I now just wait for stuff to come to me. I do sometimes have to get a video made, so I will sit down and try to write before the idea is fully fledged in my mind, and I don't like doing that. But yeah, I write a lot faster when I've been mowing the lawn or running or something and go, oh, it's this, like this, that's how you write this video.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, in general, like, I know what you mean about not wanting to make yourself sound like you think of yourself as the modern day Socrates or something when you use words like deep or profound or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is a level of depth and thought and care that clearly goes into what you're doing. But yeah, it's interesting that you would say that's kind of just how you are in general. You're thinking a lot about those kind of things, so it doesn't seem different or extra or whatever to you. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, the next question I have for you, I have to make a small assumption, but it's probably not too unreasonable. You seem at least like a person that gets quite a lot done. I'm sure you have days where you want to get more done and different stuff, but you manage to dedicate a decent amount of time to language learning, from what I can tell, and all that on top of the fact, like you say, you do photography, you've got a family, to my understanding, that you probably care about and want to spend time with, so you're juggling all these different things, which I would assume is largely a product of prioritizing and organizing. Which I am interested in how you maybe think about that kind of stuff. But I'm also interested because when we talk about this idea of getting stuff done, the idea of motivation always comes up, and this idea of I don't know, some people are more motivated, less motivated. You need to get yourself more motivated and things. From the perspective of getting stuff done and your language learning and things, what do you think about the idea of motivation? Do you think that idea plays a part in your ability to get things done, and or do you think that we're talking about a kind of myth that looks good on memes and stuff when we talk about motivation?
That's a really good question. I feel like these days I've given myself so much to do that it's not much of a question of motivation.
Okay.
I think, for example, I remember like in year 12, so our final year of school in Australia, I was the least productive, diligent student in the world. Like I did nothing. And some people have asked me about this before, that I was essentially kicked out of German class because I did so little that the teacher just wondered why I was there. Like that, I was the worst student. And then in first year uni, I was like the best. And
Okay.
some of it, like, and people would assume that that's like, oh, well, at uni you're doing what you want to do, right? I studied music, so
Yeah,
you're
that would
like, you're
make
studying
sense.
music and so. Well, it was actually that for some reason my first semester, first year was 5 courses, which is unusually high. That's
Okay.
considered a lot. 3 is considered full time, 4 is considered full time plus some, 5 is
Hmm.
considered almost double full time. Um, and it's almost like I just found I had so much to do that I couldn't I couldn't slack off. So I didn't get in
Right.
the habit of slacking off because it was like you can't slack off on week one because there's all this stuff to do, and then you go week two, oh, there's all this stuff to do, and it just keeps
Right.
going around like that. So in the last couple of years, I've become a more productive person, uh, mainly by having more things to do, and it's
Mm.
a lot easier when you know what you're doing next. Like,
Mm.
those days where you maybe can clean the apartment, maybe can, maybe you should do some exercise, maybe you're going to spend some time in Spanish, or maybe none of those things. You're not really sure.
Hmm.
You tend to get almost nothing done on those days. You
Yeah.
don't clean the apartment, you don't do any exercise, and you
Hmm.
maybe spend 20 minutes in Spanish, but not as much as you hoped for, or whatever.
Right.
And I feel like most of my days are the opposite to that, where I'm like, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. So it's very clear, like when I get up in the morning, it's like, okay, it's one of these 3 things. I'm not always organized. That is, I don't
Hmm.
always know exactly what I should be doing, but I've always have something to look at on the list and go, that I'll choose that first.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
so
Yeah.
it's yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I can agree with that. I always find that days on which I have, the whole afternoon open or whatever, I look at that day in the calendar and I'm like, whew, watch what happens when I get to that day. I'm going to get so much done. And then the
Yeah.
amount of Netflix I unnecessarily watch on that day is unfathomable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. That makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. But you said that you don't necessarily think of yourself as that organized or like how.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I don't keep a diary.
Right.
I'm trying to get better at it, and this is one of those things I've just slowly gotten a little bit better. So I'm getting a
Hmm.
little bit better at actually keeping a diary that I use consistently and without having to think about it. Like, as in, I just go, oh, I've got to write that in, or I'll forget it.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't always know. Like, for example, I know a list of things that I should do tomorrow,
Hmm.
but I don't know the order that I'm going to do them in. I haven't written them out, and by a lot of people's standards, that would be disorganized. Um,
Right.
but yeah, I just think having something to do all the time helps me to be able to do something relatively productive most of the time. And
Yeah.
language learning is really like it's almost like my downtime,
Mm.
because I've got so much other stuff to do. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I guess it's kind of the Parkinson's law idea, right, or whatever the law's called. The
Mhm.
work expands to fill the time
It's
available.
totally.
Yeah,
Oh, I have to remind myself of that so often
yeah,
because yeah, I will. I've had videos in my head that would probably only take a week, but I'm just like, I've had them in my head for a year, like just going, oh, maybe I can do it this way, maybe. And to me, they're like this big project.
mm,
Like it's like, oh no, but doing that, I'll have to take out 2 weeks and just do that for 2 weeks, and
right.
that's not true at all. If I just say that it has to be out by this Saturday, it will be.
You'll find a way
Like,
to get it done.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think my busier days and when I plan stuff out, it's they're a lot more productive. But yeah, I guess it's each their own a little bit. And but well, this is again something we talked a little bit about in our other conversation, but in terms of not just achieving like a goal, like I want to speak a bit of Spanish, in terms of like getting to like higher levels and things, um, do you think that obsession is a necessary element to reach a high, because I'm talking about like the higher levels that you're aiming for with Swedish, the Matt versus Japan kind of level with his Japanese. Obviously you've mentioned about being involved with other stuff, and you've talked about being a bit of a like that kind of person where you're just kind of all in for that amount of time. Do you think if you're not obsessive about language learning, you're going to have to understand that time period is going to expand substantially?
I think certainly the time period is going to expand substantially. I also think that language learning is a little bit unique in that way, in that at some point you're going to need to essentially flood your brain with the language, because it's a little. I feel like we don't think in our native languages. That's not quite true, but we still have thoughts that are formed, like we have thoughts in like a mental language that then turn into English or turn into and I think every time that happens, it's a tiny little chip out of your target language. It's like only minuscule, but so I feel you could kind of picture it as like a car going up a hill, and every time it just like puts the car in neutral and doesn't drive further up the hill, it starts rolling back very slowly. And so I feel like this idea of just half an hour a day, but it'll take 10 years. It's like, I'm not sure you'll ever actually get there at half an hour a day if you really want to have a deep subconscious understanding of language where you just have thoughts and they just arrive to you in the language. I don't think you can do it at half an hour a day, and not just because you won't get there in a period of time, but because you'll have too much time spent in a language that
the two steps back will cancel out the one step forward, so to speak.
Exactly.
Or the other way around.
So I think obsession is particularly useful when it comes to language learning, and it's useful at the beginning too, to get you off the ground when you're trying to watch something that you can make no sense of. It's useful just going like, I don't care, I'm just going to keep doing this for 4 hours a day. Like, not that I did that in Swedish, but it can be useful to immediately push through that stage, so that you can get to a stage where you can take it easy and go, okay, this is starting to actually make some sense now.
And I think a lot of people talk about how that that comes from developing a bit more of an emotional internal link with that language, with the people, with the culture, or something like that. And yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I've spoken on one of my videos, I think, about how it's important to understand that learning a language is not just about learning what the words mean. You have to learn about the culture, the history, the people, because all of this forms what becomes the language. The language is the expression of those things. And so for me, learning Spanish, I actually think this has been a big benefit, or this is something I've benefited from choosing a specific type of Spanish, because I think a lot of people they don't want to choose a specific type of Spanish for a variety of reasons, none of which are bad. But what it means is they never really get to know any one particular type of culture, how these one people are, or what the history is of it's bits and mix and match. Mix and match. And where I'd focused on Spain, on European Spanish, I was kind of like, so I'm focusing on Spain, on the culture of Spain, on the people, on the history, and it's you pick up so much more. I would assume you've had a similar-ish experience of, learning about the culture and the history of Sweden and things to be able to get you to a point where you're at now, and to be able to maintain that motivation. How do you, if at all consciously, how do you think about, learning more about the culture or about the history, or developing, that kind of link with the language that's a little bit deeper? Or is it something that you think has just happened because you kind of liked watching series and then you watched a load of series and then
I would actually somewhat ashamedly admit that it hasn't really happened yet. I wouldn't say that I have a particularly deep understanding of Swedish culture. Obviously it's better than someone who's not looked into Swedish stuff at all,
right,
but but I would say there's people out there who don't speak Swedish as well as I do, who probably know more about its history and things
Yeah.
like that. And there's,
Hmm.
I get enough, I understand enough, like little in jokes and things between cities, and even last night I watched something that had a pun based on the dialect of that city, where it only sounds like, it only makes sense if you say it
Hmm.
in that dialect.
Right.
But I I would say it's not great. Like there's a lot of holes that I'm kind of aware of, and my knowledge of the more specific Swedish geography, like cities in the middle and
Hmm.
things, is not great. Um, it's I don't I feel like to some extent I would have to go and watch things that actually talk about that. Like, I know that there's things out there that are like, the history of Swedish dialects, or where did the Göteborgis dialect come from? So that's like
Hmm.
Gothenburg accent, and where did Mal Malmö accent come from, and everything. I know that that stuff's out there. I
Mm.
find it kind of boring. So,
Yeah.
like,
No. Yeah.
as in, I find not super boring. It's the kind of thing that I actually do enjoy when I watch it, but it's not
Mm.
the first thing I would go to.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm not diligent in that way, and
Hmm. Yeah.
um, I
Yeah.
don't
It's
know if
it's
that's answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, as with most of my questions, I'm not really sure what I'm asking, so I wouldn't worry
Mm.
too much. But it's something I was interested in actually because of someone else. There was another kind of small YouTuber who's learning Spanish, and I think Mandarin. I think his channel's called Geospiral or something like that. But he's
Mhm.
quite strikes me as quite like a serious guy, quite a serious learner, and he's like quite big on Anki, and he has a culture deck in each of his
Right.
languages. So he has a
Yeah.
deck of information of culture and things, and that to me was like, that's quite interesting because I agree with the motivation, but I wouldn't ever do that myself. Like, I totally agree
Mm.
with what you said. There are absolutely people in the world who don't speak a word of Spanish and know much more about Spanish history and culture
Mm.
than me. I'm certainly not an expert, and there's loads of stuff that you learn about. But yeah, the more you get into, I don't know whether it's the series, the books, the movies, the references that they make, and you learn little bits about history and stuff. It you have loads of those like moments, like, oh, that's why they say
Mm.
this, or that's why this is funny, or that's why they hate those
Mhm.
guys, or I don't know, well, whatever
Yeah.
these little things are, and I do think that's quite an important part of speaking a language to a decent level. Um,
Yeah. Well, I think at the moment, I'd say if there's this theoretical divide between my conscious knowledge of Sweden and its history and my ability in the language, I would
mm,
say that at the moment my ability in the language is like a reasonable amount in front of my knowledge of its history and stuff, but not so much that it's like weird and
hmm
like it's like, dude, how do you not, you didn't even learn the capital of Sweden before you learned Swedish or something like that. It's not like
right,
that.
right,
Um, and I would prefer it to be that way than to be the other way around, where you know all about the culture and everything but don't speak a word of the language.
hmm
But so it's something that I can maybe address uh, as I learn more Swedish, and like as I improve the language, I can maybe do that through books about Swedish history and stuff. I
hmm
know there's one that Steve Kaufman's a fan of that's like, it's either called Sveriges historia, Sweden's history, or it's called Historien of Sverige, which is the story or the history of Sweden. But
hmm
it's one of those, and
okay,
it's like this. It's a like a monumental,
right,
uh, big work in their history. So,
okay,
maybe I could read that and stuff. At the moment, that's not particularly interesting to me, and Scandinavian history is somewhat interesting to me, and that's an interesting thing as well. Is the relationship between the five kind of Nordic countries: Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden,
hmm
uh, and that is actually a bit of a key to understanding Swedish.
uh-huh.
Is understanding how they think about the other countries around them.
Mm.
Um, yeah, but I wouldn't say I'm the most Scandinavianly culturally enlightened person.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's like you say, you don't need to be an ex. I mean, there's loads of British history and culture that I would get wrong if I was quizzed on it. So it's not like I'm
So
not
yeah,
British because of that.
yeah,
But it does seem like you say, it would seem strange to like if someone could speak fluent Swedish and they knew nothing about the country, they didn't know what the capital was,
yeah,
couldn't point to it on a map or anything. Like,
yeah,
so there
yeah,
seems, yeah, there's some link, but
yeah.
yeah, okay,
Yeah, and I have a friend who knows a lot of modern and ancient history, and I envy him.
yeah,
Like he's so interested in it, and he knows everything. He won us a trivia night but on his own with
right,
the single answer that was worth more than anything on the night. So and I was like, no, literally no one knew it except him,
no,
and I love that. So it's almost like if I were going to devote time to that, I would do it just on world history. Like I would just learn about like I don't know, at least World War One or something. I don't know.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so it's funny you mentioned World War One because that's sort of what sparked my interest in more recent Spanish history, because I realised that with all of the time that we spend on World War Two, because my God, that we spend a lot of time learning about World War Two in England for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
It had never occurred to me that I didn't realise that Spain basically wasn't involved in World War Two. They kind of weren't, especially not like we were in other countries. And so when I realised that, it made me feel so stupid and so ignorant to think that a country that I visited so much, that I'm quite close to, I didn't realise that, what was happening during this, quite important period of history. And yeah, so I guess you like with language learning in general, I guess you learn the stuff that you realise you don't know when you realise you don't know it, because that's just the way it works or whatever.
Yeah, and we can't beat ourselves up about this because like a student of mine was saying to me that he thinks it's sad that a lot of people haven't read the classics, like they haven't read any kind of classic literature or anything. And as his English teacher, I had to admit to him that I haven't really read any classics aside from the Shakespeare that I read at school. But I haven't read any Dickens. I haven't read any Austen, who my son is named after. And but I'm like, there's so much out there to know that everyone only knows a tiny fraction of 1% of it. And he's Austrian, so he knows a lot more about World War II than I do. But there's just so much out there, and it's only getting to be more because the history of man is only getting longer.
Right, yeah.
So
you get further and further away from knowing more.
Yeah. So I also did not realize that Spain was not involved in World War II. The only thing I know about Spain and wars is the Spanish Civil War, which I don't know much about.
Yeah, I mean, but it's what, yeah, it starts to make sense when you think about it, because that's why they had the Civil War, briefly before. But anyway, they just didn't have people and money and energy to fight. But so moving on from the Spanish Civil War, you, I think you might have skimmed over this maybe in a video, but I know you haven't really talked about it properly, and I know it's not something that there's a lot of information on in general, like proper data and stuff, but it's my understanding that you have at times in your life, or maybe still, been involved with music and playing music, learning music. What do you think about the idea that someone with an involvement in music will find language learning easier? Because that's something that people have said to me as well. I don't play very much, but I play a bit of piano. And a lot of people have said, oh, I reckon that's probably why. You got the ear for it.
I think it's, like you said, there's not a lot of data. And so I'm not a big fan of going like, oh, well, it's obviously this. Like we can just tell. But at the same time, I know people who openly confess to just not really being into music. And I don't mean not playing music. I mean not listening to music. They're just like, I just don't understand the appeal of songs. Right? And for a lot of people, for most people, that seems weird. Because I think a lot of people they like to kind of dance or whatever to the sound. They like the general idea of sound or whatever. But if you're playing music, then almost by definition, you're listening to it more carefully than the people who are just vaguely into it, and certainly more carefully than people who are just not into music at all. And so I kind of don't see how it couldn't be somewhat related. At the same time, they're not. They're pretty different, because a language is much more about the kind of structure, and like structure being associated with meaning. And one of the beauties of music is that, like, although music can be extremely profound, like just without any words or anything, it can have a profound impact on people and make them cry and make them feel things. We still don't know that the person who wrote it meant for that to be felt by it. Whereas with language, there's a more specific, like, we don't know if Dostoevsky meant exactly what we take that to mean if we read his work. But we know, like, roughly what he was getting at. Whereas, like, it may be that what Beethoven felt writing his music is not what I feel when listening to it. And so in that way, it's very different from language. But certainly I haven't come across a lot of musicians who learnt languages and weren't good at the accent. That's rare. I would say I haven't come across one at all. I have heard of one. No, I've heard of someone who was good at languages but was terrible at music. But that was only according to, like, someone she knew, that he was like, yeah, she's don't get her involved in anything musical or karaoke. She was Japanese, so he was like, her karaoke is terrible.
Okay.
Just don't. That could be a training thing. So I sort of think an interest in sound and an ability to single out sounds and go like, oh, that's an interesting thing just there. I think that has to be an advantage.
Yeah, that would make sense. Like you say, you're actively listening more, and you're listening for little nuances. And when you start to engage with music, again, I'm not very good, but I know I'm better than the average person that doesn't really do anything with music. And you notice that maybe, like, the average person, there's little things that they don't know. A little semitone can slip by their ear a lot easier than it will yours. You know, they'll try and reproduce a melody, and in their head the notes are changing, but they're kind of just changing the shape of their mouth and making the same sound, and so they're not actually making different notes, but they don't actually hear that they're not reproducing the notes that they heard originally. And exactly, so that element of it.
I always thought that, like, because I've always felt that people, English speakers and particularly Australians trying to speak languages, it always sounded well off to me, even if I spoke none of the language, which was basically always, because I've only recently learned a language. But it always sounds like Australians speaking French is like, there's actually a classic joke here that it's like, oui, merci pour vous, and it's like, it just doesn't sound. And for a long time I thought it was just people being lazy and just going, oh, yes, okay, I should be saying merci, but I'm going to say merci because it's boring, because I can't be bothered. But now I realize it's like, oh, that actually sounds the same to you. You think that you're saying it correctly, and so it sounds super, again, like pretty big-headed, but like after a long time I kind of went, oh, I actually do hear things with a lot more clarity than a lot of other people do. That's not to say it's perfect. No. But yeah,
it's interesting. Yeah, I certainly don't have perfect pitch, but yeah, maybe there are elements of that. Well, switching to the other side, staying with the music, what do you think of music as a tool, from your experience at least, as a language learning tool?
Going back to the shiny object syndrome, I actually almost don't like getting music involved in other things, because to me the music is so pure that I don't like to mix it up to, like, it's almost like whenever I listen to music, that's what I'm doing. So it seems almost, this may be putting it a little bit strongly, but it's almost like people like who who date for language learning partners. Like
Right.
it's like it just feels a bit icky. It's almost like, no, don't use that person for your. And that's how I feel about music, even though it's not a person. And
Right.
I could obviously use it for the benefit of my French or my Swedish or whatever, but whenever I listen to music that I like, and I don't listen to music that I don't like, obviously,
Right.
it's like I'm like, that's why I want to listen to it. So I did do a video a year and a half ago or so about like French artists, French music artists. But when I watched that video back, I've got like 2 or 3 second clips of each of them. And I'm always like, I just want to get back into this just for this music.
Right.
Like, and I listen to lots of music in languages that I don't speak a word of.
Okay.
And I enjoy that. Like, so
That's interesting. Yeah, the music is kind of its own element, its own person to you. Okay.
Although I will say that I went back, I listened to Swedish music like right at the beginning, because that's one of those tips that you hear, like, oh, listen to songs in your target language. And I went back and I knew them well, and I went back and listened to them again recently, and I was like, oh yeah, it's totally different when you can completely understand what they're saying. Like,
yeah,
as in, it's the same, but it feels weird. It's like it just feels so weird.
It's not the same. Yeah, I had that exact experience because I also dance salsa, and so obviously most salsa music is in Spanish. And now when I listen to salsa music, I can understand a lot of it. And it's often worse because not all of the time, but quite often the lyrics attached to salsa music aren't all that logical. And it's all
I
a
thought
bit.
you were going to say they're not all that clean.
Oh well, sometimes there's that, but sometimes it's just a bit random and it's a bit weird. And like I've asked some Spanish people, I'm like, wait, have I completely misunderstood that? And they're like, no, it rhymes, so it's in the song. It's fine. And so like that element of it to me has always put me off of using music too much. Like I've analysed the lyrics of one rapper, a couple of songs that I like of one Spanish rapper, and I found that really interesting, but I wouldn't do that all the time because the language being used is either really colloquial to the point where I would sound out of place using it, right? Like it's like if you come to England and you start using London slang, it sounds weird because you're not from London, right? And there's that element, but then there's also, because it's very poetic and very colourful and very flowery. It's like they're words that are very literary almost. They're words that you can't really use that much. And then you have the element of the way it's pronounced is nothing like how someone would use it in an actual conversation. I imagine people trying to learn English, listening to English music, and just thinking, how do you translate these vowels being thrown all over the place into like regular speech? And like I've always been torn because you talked about the element of just loving the music, and I can understand how that would help people to get deeper into the culture and to create that attachment and stuff. But then the type of language you're exposing yourself to is like, I don't know, it's like or like only watching kids shows, for example, where they're always talking in a weird voice. Like, of course you can watch kids shows, but like if that's the vast majority of your input, that's going to make you talk weird, surely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a lot on the language, because I understand that in some languages they are more sort of just straight, like they just use the language as it would be used in speech. But the songs that I was listening to that I knew quite well, I knew the music well, and now I listened to them again and heard all the Swedish. That was like, to me, it sounded like relatively normal Swedish. Now when I hear it, I'm like, oh, okay, yep, she says that makes sense, but yeah, there's always going to be some what I'm saying is that I wouldn't use it to learn. Like I probably wouldn't. What I do use it for, I wouldn't sit down and study it and go, okay, these are these words and this is what this means. Or what I do use it for, which works very well for me, is to create a kind of attachment to that world and put me very much back in the headspace of that, which isn't so important now, probably because my Swedish is like quite good that nothing else feels like Swedish. If I were to take up, say, French again, when I know which I'm speaking because like my Swedish is good and my
Right.
French is not. So like
Right.
I would know. But back when I was doing the two at the same time, it was very important for me to get in a different headspace for each one. And I find music can put me in a headspace like that. And I even still have music that I attach to German from when I did German at school, and it's very much evocative of Germany things for me.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
that Germanish things. So that's what I use it for, if I use it at all. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's almost like I love music too much to abuse it in that way.
That's really interesting. I like that way of looking at it. I can understand that though, because I'm big into music as well, and a lot of
Mhm,
instrumental music as well. And I'm that guy. I can
mhm.
I can cry at the right chord progression and stuff. So it's
Oh
you
yeah,
get that
oh
deep
yeah.
attachment to stuff, and yeah, it's interesting.
In a little YouTube, a tip of mine, because I back in one of my early videos, I needed to make myself cry, and I can use certain songs that will work every time.
Okay,
Like,
yeah,
yeah,
good
yep,
plan. Yeah,
yep.
nice. um, Okay, so another thing that I'm interested in getting your opinion on, I know we're getting on a little bit,
Mm,
but I'm nearly done.
mm.
But
Yeah.
something, yeah, that's quite interesting to me. I want to know about your opinion on the utility of language challenges. And I
Hmm.
guess there's a couple of perspectives here because, well, from my standpoint anyway, we have like the element of, for the individual learner, but then we also have the larger element of, the YouTube world and clickbait and different
Mm,
things. So I want to start
mm.
with, the utility for individuals and your experience with, because I know you've done some little challenges, like you did Mark's 40-hour 7-day, however you say that. I think you
Yep.
did like 50 something hours or whatever, but the work
Yeah, yeah,
week, right, where you're supposed to
yeah,
do like a week's worth of work but in
yeah,
language.
yeah. I did
um
57, but I took 7 days to do it, so it
okay, yeah,
worked out.
see,
What, it's 8 hours a day? Yep.
yeah, keep your 40 hours, I'll do 50.
Yeah.
And you did your 10 books in a month, which, by the
Yeah.
way, just because now I'm fairly confident that you're the kind of person that's not going to take any offense to this anyway, I am
Mm.
absolutely going to read 11 books in 1 month just to be a bit of an ass. But anyway, I know you've done some of these little challenges. Like, what do you think the benefit of those were for you? Are they things that you would do fairly regularly, or is it just a bit of fun as like a detour from your regularly scheduled learning? Let's see.
It's a bit of both. I would love to do them more regularly, but keeping up with making videos is a very big commitment. So sometimes it's almost like, to do this challenge, I need to take a whole month off making videos just to do this and then make a
Right.
video about it, kind of thing. As
Mm-hmm.
in, it's like there wouldn't be a video for 4 weeks and then there'd be this video about this challenge, kind of thing. So
Mm-hmm.
th- it's something I would like to do more of, but it's a bit of a reality of how much other stuff I have to do. But I I just find that, like, just setting these kind of arbitrary, and not arbitrary, but like they just invented borders in our mind of like, oh, 10 books in a month. Like, why not 9 books in a month? It's like,
Mm.
because we have arbitrarily assigned a value to 10
Mm-hmm.
based on the number of fingers we have, seemingly.
Right.
um like, there's no another culture might be base 7 or whatever.
Right.
I'd
Right.
forget the maths behind it, but they're like, 10 is just this weird thing that we just came up with, that's like
We
how
like
many
it.
we have of stuff. Yeah.
Mm.
um so but and when you kind of go with that stuff, to me, it creates this thing of like, well, can I do it? Is it too much, or is it easy, or like? And so I find that if the higher I set it, the more likely I am to pursue it, um, because it seems so, like, I don't want it to be so low that
Mm-hmm.
it's like, oh well, of course I can do it. It's like, I read somewhere, what is easy to do is also easy to not do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's sort of taking that to the extreme of saying, okay, what if we make it quite hard to do? Um, and that's what I've gotten out of them. What was your question again?
Well, yeah, I was asking about like the utility you got from those, and like if you would do them very regularly, and yeah, why you did them. I guess that's pretty much the
Yeah,
answer, and
yeah.
yeah.
Well,
Um,
obviously you can't do them so often as that they that it's not interesting anymore. So it's just like it's just a short period of time to which you can say, okay, this is intense, but it will be over soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what it's been for me. I've done a couple of similar things. I did try the 40-hour, 7-day thing, but I didn't actually end up recording any of it or whatever. Obviously, I did my 12 books in 12 weeks, which at the time was impressive. But
well, it was impressive, yeah.
Yeah, like you say, they're kind of these. It's not so short that nothing's going to get done, but it's long enough so that you're going to see progress, but you're not going to burn out completely. I mean, sometimes. I don't know if you consider this in the same way, but I also said to myself, well, I'm going to do 500 hours of immersion in 6 months. That to me was a similar idea. It's a challenge. It's like, okay, 6 months is a decent amount of time, but I've looked at it. I reckon I can get this done, and it's like a little extra push. It moves forward, and it's almost like. I don't know, for example, with the 40 hours, if you start doing like 5-6 hours a day, of course, you're not going to continue doing that. But chances are you will knock on an extra 15 or 30 minutes to what you were doing beforehand because you've gotten used to doing more and you've made that a normality. And I think that's...
Exactly.
That's definitely helped me with Spanish. But I have also played around a little bit with... I did it with Portuguese where I did like a speaking challenge. And of course, this is in the other conversation. I'm having trouble thinking about what we've referred to now in this conversation, the other conversation. But we talked about how, learning Portuguese after learning Spanish is a lot easier. So it's not like I was doing that from the beginning, but it was the sort of early stages of my process. Do you think that these kind of challenges and these ideas of, challenges at the beginning of someone's language learning journey, do you think that changes it a lot? Do you think it then becomes too much about this idea of master the language in 2-3 months? Or do you think something like that could be a good way to, get yourself off to a good start? I'm going to do, 30 days of every day of X language or whatever, or,
I think it's a good way to get off to it, to get off to a good start for sure. Like if you say, for example, an hour, it probably needs to be a little bit more exact for a beginner. Like if you say, an hour of German, that's going to be like half an hour of deliberate study where you do some course that you've got or some textbook or something, and half an hour of listening to a German podcast or something. If you do that for a month, that's pretty substantial for a beginner, but at the same time, their German will improve. It will get somewhere in 30 hours. That's the concept, the first 20 hours that the guy gave a TED talk about and wrote a book. And it's like, it's
plays
like
the ukulele or something.
Yeah. Actually, I feel like his kind of 20 hours thing was like, meh, is that really what you wanted to spend your 20 hours on? But I think it's a good idea of like, I think the general idea is that it's like, well, if it's going to take 1,000 hours to get pretty good at anything, but don't worry about that. Don't think about that. Just think about the first 20 hours. So I think it's a great idea. As no longer a proponent of the speak early methodology, I would say you shouldn't expect to have a very good conversation after that long. And if you do expect that, then you're going to disappoint yourself. And I would even say, if you can possibly avoid it, don't have a conversation. As in, if you really want a high level, but that's a whole different thing where you're saying like, because again, you're saying that's saying to the beginner, like, you should be thinking about where you want to be in 1,000 hours time, which I guess is the opposite of the challenge. So,
it's interesting you mentioned the speak early thing. I don't want to dig in on this too much because I know you have talked about it recently. But I was quite surprised to hear you talk about your new sort of thoughts on the speaking and this kind of thing. I know that you've been immersion heavy for quite a while and things, but I guess the reason I say surprised is because of it, again, similar to you talking about my Spanish. I don't know Swedish, so it's hard to tell, but I've watched you do interviews and full-on conversations and stuff. It's functional at the least. How do you kind of it's a bit of a strong word. How do you justify to yourself that your Swedish, could be so much better when you've already achieved quite a lot with a method that you've now come to believe that isn't that effective? Do you believe that you would be that much further along now had you not spoken early, or is it like, what would the difference be, I suppose, if you'd done it the way you wanted to have done it now from the beginning?
I actually believe that maybe about half my current overall capability has come since adopting a more input-heavy approach in, say, June last year.
Okay.
So what's that now? 15, 16 months?
Yeah.
And whereas my total... it's not that heavily weighted, but like my total time in Swedish has been like close to 5 years. And in 16 months, I'd say I've basically doubled my overall competence,
Right.
adopting an input heavy approach. So I think that I genuinely could have been at this same level at this time last year, if not even earlier than that, just by not even by cutting out speaking completely, but just by having more input. So things like you said you've watched me do interviews and whatnot. I certainly didn't do much of that stuff at all, and certainly no interviews, nothing unplanned.
Right.
Before I adopted that approach.
Right.
And
Okay.
so that was in early May, I think, that I did that I spoke to Claudia, and which is my longest thing in Swedish that's
Okay.
like unplanned and everything. Definitely couldn't have done that the year before.
Right. Okay.
Even though I felt in my lessons, I felt more or less fluent in Swedish,
Right.
but not like it actually wasn't. Like, as in when I was talking, I was like, yeah, this is going okay. But then when I watched that back, I was like,
Right.
you can't present this as being able to speak the language.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, I would say that I still think it'd be much more effective if I'd focused more on input at the start.
Okay. And do you think, obviously, because now you would, because you know what you can get out of it and stuff, but do you think if we imagine you going back in time and you doing this, focusing on this input heavy, do you think you would have been able to stick to it without speaking, without engaging? Because from my experience, that became a big thing for me. The joy that I got out of largely terribly engaging with other Spanish people in Spanish. I don't know if I would have been able to do 1,200 hours of listening without speaking to anyone, or without, I don't know, getting anxious about, am I actually learning, or I don't know. Would you imagine that part of it being difficult?
That was my big issue with the input heavy crowd before I kind of came over to their side,
Right.
you might say. I was like, but how would you motivate yourself to do that? I don't think that I and along with Matt himself don't think that it needs to be as extreme as that.
Right.
So he has a video about like, is speaking early like really that bad? And I like go and watch that video if people are interested. But he basically puts in a bunch of things. It's like, no, it's actually not that bad. You just have to bear a few things in mind. But the thing is, I was like, not the only input I really got back in the day was through the teacher talking to me.
Right.
And when you really, really suck at the language, you get, even now, I've worked out that I speak for about 40 minutes of a lesson and a teacher will speak for 20 minutes.
Okay.
But back then I'd say it was more like I speak for 55 minutes and the teacher would speak for 5 minutes.
Right.
Because you're like, this, and the teacher's like, you mean mate? That you went to the park?
Yeah.
Or like, like they'll like put all these things that you just spent a minute assembling and they'll be like, oh, so you do own a car? Yes, I own a car, kind of thing. So
right.
I'm not saying that I would go, let's imagine I start a new language today. I wouldn't just say, no, I'm going to do 1,200 hours without speaking at all, but I would just, that would be the focus, would be the input. And every now and then I'll take a lesson, and yeah, it does. I love it. It does feel really good, even when you suck at the language, to say something and they go, yeah, I get what you're saying. I do love that feeling. I've done that in Arabic, despite I speak no Arabic. But I love that feeling when the teacher's like, yeah, that's good. I just wouldn't do it nearly as much because I did it way too much.
That does make a lot of sense. I don't know that I'd realised that like you mentioned, that most of the input you would have been getting at that time was from the teachers and from those classes. I don't think I'd realised that you weren't necessarily doing as much input outside alongside the classes. Okay.
I wasn't doing any because I didn't. I was sort of the other way to what you just described, of where you like, I don't think I could do 1,200 hours of input without speaking. I was like, I would put something on. I'd put something on in Swedish without subtitle. I'd turn the English subtitles off and just be like, this is completely useless. I can't understand a word they're saying, kind of thing. And I didn't understand back then that you just have to keep doing it, and you just have to push through it.
Yeah.
Or that you can like maybe watch something that you've watched before without English subtitles and blah blah. So I was just like, this is dumb. I can't understand this. It's like it was a waste of time. I'm never going to learn the language this way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard sell. I mean, I'm sure you've had similar experiences. You talk to friends that don't learn languages about learning languages, and they're like, oh, you're obviously really good at this, that, or the other. And you're like, well, no, if you sit with this, your brain is kind of custom evolved to actually adapt to all this kind of stuff. And they're just looking at you like, nah, I don't believe a word of it. Not a word. And it's a hard sell because it doesn't make sense. It shouldn't make sense, or maybe it shouldn't make sense.
That's what I said to Matt. I was like, don't you think it's a little bit harder to sell that concept? And he's like, yeah, it's way harder to sell, but like, I don't really care what's hard to sell. I care what works. Yeah,
absolutely. So let's say you've got a decent level of Swedish for now. Obviously, you've talked a lot about how you want to get to a much better level, or to add a lot more nuance and things. And how do you think about setting goals for your Swedish? Because setting goals in language learning in general, I think, is difficult. But especially, I guess I'm interested in especially that element of, you can't be perfect, you can't be Swedish, but you want to be better, and that you can be better. How do you personally balance those two elements?
I don't have. I kind of don't really have goals for my Swedish anymore, except for occasionally, like I want to finish this book, or I want to watch this series or something. Like a little bit more than that. But I'm actually thinking very seriously now about taking up French, because I feel like I'm at a point in my Swedish where not only like will it kind of be fine, like it won't be too affected by, and also I spend a lot of time in it just anyway, like it's just a normal part of my day, and that's not going to stop. But I also feel like it'll hold quite well. But it's also that it's like I feel like there's not a lot more to do except be in, like, as in, it's not that I can't get better, but it's very hard to get better from here, as in from Australia. So I did mention in a video last year that I wanted to go to Sweden, and that was actually a goal that was sort of language related, but like I wanted to go to Sweden and make a video with a Swedish YouTuber, and still now I still have that in mind, and it's been made a lot more difficult with COVID, which was already a thing then. It's been made actually again more difficult because of certain Australian laws about our borders and stuff, which is really annoying. Mainly it's been made more expensive. So I still kind of have that in mind, but like basically I've actually now come to a point where I can't not spend time in Swedish. I watch stuff with my son. I read books to my son. And I speak to my son, which I wouldn't say actually helps that much, except for except for actually just having to form thoughts in language. But but that's a very automatic thing now. Like I can literally speak to my wife, and then I see him doing something, and I'm like, "Nej, men vad håller du på med?"
It's not like you take a second and switch. And,
yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, and just because of that, I just kind of go, I'm not really challenging myself anymore. And so I'm almost sort of out of material to talk about on my channel in a way, in that I'm like, because I'm not doing it anymore. I'm just, I now have these two. Yeah. Like I just have these two languages, and it's far from perfect, but I have them in my life. And so I'm considering taking up French again for that reason. But I don't know that that's a very good answer to your question.
Well, I think it is in some ways, because there's a lot of importance is put on the idea of goal setting, and you need to have a goal, and you need to have clear goals, and this and that. And for almost everything else I've done in my life, I've been very heavy on that idea, and it's been a big part of what I've done. But it does seem more and more that the idea of having these super specific goals in a language not only is quite difficult to define, but seems to be less applicable, because there seems to be so many elements that can draw someone to a language, or that they can be drawn in by, and the fact that like the language is, that whole idea of the language isn't the subject. It's like you're not doing a thing, you're kind of living, but you're doing it with a different audio code, let's say, to interact. So I guess maybe that makes some differences, and maybe you don't really need so much emphasis on this big specific goal.
Well, I think that's why certainly my kind of everyday Swedish of just like someone makes a tiny little bit of a joke and I hear that and pick it up and laugh and everything. That's obviously not nearly as developed as it could be, because I don't live there. So that's why I kind of had the goal of making a video with a Swedish YouTuber, in the idea that like I want to be a part of their video where like they say something and I'm like, what? Oh yeah. And we kind of interact. And so I would have to actually build up my skills in that. Even like I'd have to go there, spend some time there, and then make the video and all of that. So I guess I think more about it in terms of life goals now, and how I can kind of build those in. And I did have some ideas of people I wanted to interview and stuff, and I'm hopefully going to be interviewed on a Swedish channel soon, which I know you've done a number of times.
I've done a couple of times now. It's a pretty cool feeling, I'm not going to lie. It's very scary, because you know that other people are going to actually listen to it with the intention of learning from you speaking, but So, and actually, I have another one that's still under wraps. I should have finished it long ago, but I started it when my computer went down and I couldn't do anything for a while. So that's a kind of, it's a non-language, it's a language related thing, but it's a separate goal. So Okay, interesting. Well, I was actually going to just finish by sort of asking what are the chances of us seeing days of French back intermixed with the days of Swedish, but seeing as you've already said that, maybe in the future, we'll leave that one for a second. But carrying on with this idea of goals and things, just to kind of finish off, have you ever had any inclination to want to do any kind of language exam or any kind of formal certification as a way of either progressing or just in general, just to kind of say, look, I'm awesome?
I have. I would like to have a C2 certificate at some point, which I'm not. I can definitely not C2 at the moment. I'm pretty damn confident that I would pass anything that's called itself a C1 exam. I base that on a number of factors, not just my feeling. But I don't actually know what's out there in Sweden, because in Sweden, in Swedish, they have a few different like proficiency exams, but I think all of them, to my knowledge, basically just say that like you're good to do these kinds of jobs or this kind of job or whatever in Sweden. and one of them says like this is basically equivalent to a C1,
Okay.
but I don't know of anything that it sort of certifies C2. So
Right.
there might be, but it would probably involve going to Swedish university, I think,
Okay.
which
Yeah.
could be difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
yeah.
Fair enough. Cool. Okay. Interesting. Well, dude, it's been absolutely awesome being able to sit and chat with you. Sorry, especially given that we were just chatting before we started recording this one as well. So it's coming up
Yeah.
on 3 hours of language learning goodness, which is always good fun. But yeah, thank you very much for sharing your time with me, and yeah, I hope it's been somewhat interesting for you as well.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on, mate. It has been very interesting to talk to someone who is involved in pretty different things, like
Mm.
your acrobatics and stuff. It's not always the same kind of other fields that language learners are involved in. So.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Cool. Well, yeah, thank you very much.